Imagine this. You are 20 years old, barely out of high school, and you are sitting on the open edge of a helicopter. The blades above you roar like thunder, chopping the humid air of Vietnam into a constant scream. Your legs dangle into the open sky, 1,000 feet of nothing beneath you, and all that keeps you connected to the aircraft is a worn canvas strap around your chest. In your hands rests an M60 machine gun, heavy and hot, its barrel already scorched from the last burst of fire. 2,000 rounds of ammunition sit coiled between your knees like a living, breathing snake. The jungle below is endless. It is green and dark and alive with things you cannot see. Somewhere down there, maybe behind a line of trees or hidden in a rice paddy, men are waiting for you. Men with rifles, men with machine guns, men with rockets aimed at the fragile shell of aluminum and glass that you are hanging from. You tell yourself not to think about it, but the truth is simple. You are both the hunter and the hunted. The helicopter shudders, dipping lower, skimming just above the treetops. You feel every vibration through the soles of your boots. Your heart pounds with it, keeping rhythm with the rotor blades. You scan the ground, finger tight on the trigger, eyes searching for the flicker of movement that might mean life or death. At this moment, you are the door gunner. You are the thin line of defense for your crew, your brothers, and the soldiers packed in the back of the Huey. Now let me ask you something. Would you trade your life, willingly, to shield your friends from bullets? Would you hang half your body outside a flying target just so the men beside you might live to see tomorrow? That was the job of the door gunner. In the Vietnam War, helicopters became more than just transport. They were lifelines. They carried men into battle and carried the wounded back out. They delivered supplies, evacuated villages, and brought the fight to places no truck or jeep could ever reach. The UH-1 Huey, with its wide sliding doors and beating heart of a turbine engine, became the symbol of the entire war. And standing in those doors, gripping the gun, was a young man like me. We were not pilots, though we trusted them with our lives. We were not officers, though we bore the same risks. We were kids, often just out of our teens, thrown into a role that was as terrifying as it was essential. At first, there was no such position as door gunner. The early crews had only a pilot, a co-pilot, and a crew chief who doubled as a gunner. But the war was unforgiving. Helicopters were shot down at alarming rates, ambushed in landing zones, riddled with enemy fire. Command realized quickly that more protection was needed. A fourth man was added to the crew. His task was simple in words but brutal in reality. Sit on the edge, aim the gun, and keep the enemy at bay. We called it riding shotgun, but there was nothing casual about it. The strap that held you in was called a monkey harness, and sometimes it saved your life. Sometimes it failed. More than one man slipped, fell, or was blown out of his seat by the force of the rotor wash or the sudden jolt of enemy fire. Every mission carried that risk. Yet still we climbed aboard. Still we strapped in. Because without that door gunner, the helicopter was naked, exposed, and vulnerable. It was a job that carried a strange mix of power and helplessness. On one hand, we had the firepower of a machine gun capable of tearing through a tree line in seconds. On the other, we were exposed targets, easy marks for any Viet Cong hidden with a rifle or an RPG. We lived in that contradiction. We breathed it. And every time the Huey lifted off, we wondered if we would make it back. That contradiction defined our existence. We carried the thunder of the machine gun in our hands, yet we knew a single well-placed bullet could end us in an instant. We had no armored walls like the men in tanks. We had no trenches to dig into for cover. What we had was the open air, the beating heart of the Huey, and the blind faith that if we fired fast enough, if we watched closely enough, maybe, just maybe, we would get the chance to come back. The helicopter was everything in Vietnam. Soldiers on the ground called it the sound of hope. You could hear it long before you saw it. The thump 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 of the rotor blades rolling over the jungle meant supplies were coming, reinforcements were near, or wounded men were about to be carried to safety. It also meant the enemy knew exactly where we were. That sound carried for miles, echoing through valleys and bouncing off hills, announcing our presence long before we ever touched down. The Huey itself was a miracle of the era. It was fast, versatile, and could lift a squad of men straight into the thick of combat. It could hover above the treetops, dart between valleys, and land in a patch of mud barely larger than its rotor span. But as miraculous as it was also fragile. The thin aluminum skin could be pierced by rifle fire. The plexiglass windshield shattered like sugar under a single round. Enemy forces quickly realized that helicopters were both the backbone of American mobility and one of its weakest points. That was where the door gunner came in. At first the crews were small. The pilot flew, the co-pilot navigated, and the crew chief maintained the bird while also manning a gun when needed. But in Vietnam that wasn't enough. The Viet Cong were masters of ambush, waiting until the Hueys slowed for landing before unleashing hell. Entire platoons could be pinned down in the landing zone if the helicopters had no suppressing fire. Too many aircraft went down in those early months, burning in the fields, their crews lost before they even had a chance. Command responded the only way it could. They added a fourth man. His sole mission: provide constant fire from the open door. Keep the enemy's heads down. Protect the infantry during landings and takeoffs. Create a wall of lead so the men stepping off the skids might live long enough to fight. It was a brutal solution, but it worked. Losses decreased, survival increased, and the door gunner became as much a part of the Huey as the pilot at the stick. The first time I strapped myself into that harness, I remember thinking how absurd it was. There was no armor, no shield. Just me, the wind, and the weapon in my hands. But the first time we went into a hot landing zone, when bullets cracked past my helmet and I saw the men rushing out the door, I understood. They needed us. They needed that wall of fire. Without it, they were nothing but targets running into open ground. And so we learned, quickly and brutally, that our role was not just important, it was essential. To understand why the door gunner became such a vital figure, you have to step back and look at the war itself. Vietnam was unlike any conflict America had fought before. It was not a war of front lines and trenches like World War I. It was not a war of vast tank battles and sweeping invasions like World War II. Vietnam was a war of shadows, ambushes, and an enemy that blended into the jungle and the villages. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army were not bound to fight on open fields. They struck where they wanted, melted into the landscape, and forced us to adapt. That adaptation came in the form of what the army called air mobility. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of moving troops slowly by truck, jeep, or on foot through endless jungle, we would lift them by helicopter and drop them directly where they were needed. The helicopter would erase the obstacles of rivers, swamps, and thick forests. It would turn impassable terrain into an open highway in the sky. Soldiers would no longer have to march for days to reach a battlefield. Instead, they could be there in minutes. And at the center of this revolution was the UH-1 Iroquois, better known as the Huey. Its distinctive shape, with the long rotor blades and wide sliding doors, became the very image of the Vietnam War. The Huey was more than a machine. For us, it was a lifeline, a weapon, and sometimes a coffin. It could carry infantry, haul supplies, evacuate the wounded, and rain fire on the enemy, all in a single day. But in those early years the crews were small. A pilot and a co-pilot up front, a crew chief in the back. The crew chief handled maintenance and often manned a machine gun when the helicopter was in flight. For a time that seemed enough. After all, this was supposed to be a war of mobility, not of pitched battles. But Vietnam had other plans. The first real test came in places like the Ia Drang Valley in 1965. Helicopters carrying soldiers into landing zones found themselves ambushed the moment they approached. The Viet Cong and NVA understood our dependence on the Huey and targeted it mercilessly. Entire formations of helicopters were raked with machine gun fire. Some were hit by recoilless rifles or even Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft weapons. A single Huey could carry a dozen men, and when it went down, the loss was staggering. For the men flying into those landing zones, The lesson was immediate and brutal. They needed more firepower. The crew chief's single gun was not enough to cover both sides of the aircraft. Pilots could maneuver, but they could not both fly and fight. The Huey had the speed, but it lacked the teeth. The answer was not found in thicker armor or bigger engines. The answer was another man with another gun. At first, he was called the shotgun rider. His job was to sit by the door with a weapon, mostly just a rifle or light machine gun, and provide whatever extra fire he could. But as the intensity of the war grew, this role hardened into something official. The shotgun rider became the door gunner. He was given the M60, mounted or slung for flexibility, and his seat was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. Every Huey that went into combat now had a fourth man. It was the birth of a new kind of soldier. Not an infantryman in the mud, not a pilot at the controls, but something in between. A warrior strapped to the side of a flying machine, exposed to the sky, tasked with keeping everyone else alive. Once the door gunner became official, everything about helicopter warfare changed. The Huey was no longer just a flying truck. It was a weapon system in its own right. The two door gunners, one on each side, turned the aircraft into a fortress of lead. Their arcs of fire covered the landing zones, swept tree lanes, and laid down suppression so infantry could hit the ground running. What had started as a desperate improvisation became standard doctrine. This was the true heart of air mobility. It wasn't just about moving troops quickly. It was about bringing them in under a shield of firepower, keeping them alive long enough to fight. Generals could deploy battalions into remote jungles or highland valleys that had never seen an American boot before. And when they did, the first and last thing those soldiers heard was the chatter of M60s pouring fire from the doors of Hueys. But this new strategy came at a cost. By creating this fourth role, the Army had placed young men, barely trained, barely grown, into one of the most dangerous seats of the war. They had to learn fast. The crew chief and pilots depended on them. The infantry below depended on them. Sometimes the entire mission hinged on whether the door gunners could keep the enemy suppressed for 30 seconds longer. And make no mistake, the enemy adapted quickly. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were not fools. They watched. They learned. They placed heavy machine guns along likely landing zones. They dug spider holes near clearings where Hueys were forced to hover. They trained marksmen to wait for the door gunners, the most exposed targets on the aircraft. The statistics told the story. Door gunners had some of the highest casualty rates of any role in the air war. Not only were they vulnerable to small arms fire, but they were also the first hit when RPGs or 23mm anti-aircraft cannons opened up from the jungle. And yet, despite those odds, men volunteered. Sometimes they volunteered out of duty. Sometimes out of adrenaline. And sometimes because they knew that without them, the Huey was a coffin waiting to fall. By the mid-1960s, no one questioned the need for door gunners. They were as much a part of the Huey silhouette as the spinning blades above. You could not think of the helicopter without thinking of those two figures crouched in the doorways, eyes scanning, fingers on the trigger. It became a symbol of the war itself. The helicopter thundering through the sky, the jungle whipping past below, and a door gunner leaning out into the wind, bracing himself against the chaos. A day in the life of a door gunner never followed a schedule, but it always began the same way, with the sound of the rotor blades. That deep, rhythmic thump was our alarm clock, our call to duty, and sometimes our last lullaby at night. We woke in the early hours, often before dawn, the air heavy with humidity and the smell of diesel fuel. The flight line stretched before us, Hueys sitting like restless horses ready to bolt into the sky. Our routine was simple on paper, but never simple in reality. First came the checks. Ammo belts fed, weapons oiled, radios tested, straps secured. You learned quickly that forgetting a small detail could mean disaster later. I would run my hands along the M60, feel the cool steel, tug the belt of ammunition to be sure it wouldn't snag. It wasn't just a ritual. It was survival. Then came the waiting. 90% of our job was waiting. Waiting for the call, waiting for the next mission, waiting for something to happen. We sat in the shade when we could find it, passing cigarettes back and forth, telling jokes that weren't funny, laughing anyway because laughter kept the fear away. We played cards on the hood of a Jeep, we carved names into ammo crates, we wrote letters home we never finished. Anything to keep our minds from asking the question we didn't want to answer. Would today be our last flight? But when the call came, everything shifted in an instant. The laughter cut off. Cards scattered in the dirt. Cigarettes hit the ground half-smoked. We ran to the bird, strapped in, and suddenly the world roared alive. The Huey lifted, the jungle spread out beneath us, and we became part of the machine. Our missions were as varied as the war itself. Sometimes we escorted slicks into hot zones, our guns already spitting before the skids touched the ground. Sometimes we flew cover for medevacs, hovering in the storm of bullets while corpsmen dragged bleeding men aboard. Other times we carried infantry into the heart of a firefight, our job to keep their heads low until boots hit the mud. And always, the most dangerous moments were the landings and takeoffs. Those were the seconds when the enemy waited, rifles steady, RPGs aimed, daring us to slow down long enough to die. It was in those moments that I understood the truth of our role. We weren't heroes. We weren't invincible. We were just men holding the line for as long as the belt of ammo lasted. And yet, to the soldiers jumping out the door, we were everything. Their lives were measured in the seconds we could buy them with bursts of fire. We lived minute to minute because no one knew which flight would be the last. Each mission had its own rhythm, its own flavor of fear. Escort duty was one of the most common. We would fly alongside unarmed Hueys, the slicks, loaded with infantry. Our job was simple: make sure they got in and out alive. But in Vietnam, nothing was ever simple. The enemy knew the slicks were vulnerable. They carried no heavy guns, only the men inside. That made them the perfect target. As escorts, we had to be faster, louder, and deadlier. We sprayed the treelines, the rice paddies, the ridges, anywhere a rifle barrel might flash. And we prayed that our fire would buy the slicks just enough time to land, unload, and lift again. Then there were the medevac missions. Those were different. They carried a weight the others didn't. When you flew cover for a medevac, you weren't just protecting soldiers going in, you were protecting men who had already paid the price. Bloodied, broken, barely clinging to life, they lay on stretchers while corpsmen worked frantically in the back. Our guns had to hold the line because if we failed, those men never made it out. I can still see their faces sometimes, the pale, wide-eyed stares, the hands clutching at nothing. They weren't thinking of glory. They were thinking of home. And then there was direct infantry support. Sometimes the call would come when a platoon was pinned down. We would fly low, doors open, guns blazing, sweeping the jungle just yards ahead of our own men. The pilots would skim the treetops, tilting hard so we could fire down at angles, our tracers stitching across the green canopy. The ground shook with the thunder of our rotors, and for those moments, we were angels of death, terrifying to the enemy, salvation to the men below. Every mission was different, but the feeling was always the same. A tightness in your chest, a buzzing in your ears, a knot in your stomach. You never knew when a bullet would find you or when a rocket would streak out of the jungle. You never knew if this was the flight where your number came up. And yet, in the middle of that fear, there were flashes of something else. A strange kind of pride. A sense of belonging. Because in those moments we weren't just individuals. We were part of something larger, the helicopter, the crew, the mission. We were the shield between our brothers and the grave. Sometimes, when the guns went quiet and the adrenaline drained away, I would sit there with sweat stinging my eyes and think, we did it. We kept them alive. At least for today. And that was enough. For a door gunner, the weapon was more than a tool. It was survival, identity, and sometimes, the only friend you had in the sky. The M60 machine gun was our lifeline. We called it the pig. Heavy, stubborn, prone to jamming if you didn't treat it right, but when it worked, it roared like thunder. Belt-fed, it spat out between 500 and 650 rounds per minute, Each burst a chain of fire that could cut through jungle and pin down an ambush before it swallowed us whole. I remember the ritual before every mission. I would run my hands along the M60, check the feed tray, test the trigger. The smell of gun oil mixed with sweat became second nature. You didn't just prepare the gun, you prepared yourself. Because once we lifted off, that weapon was all that stood between us and the ground in flames. But the M60 had its limits. It was powerful, yes, but sometimes the jungle seemed endless, the enemy everywhere. That's when the minigun came into play. The M134 minigun was a monster. Electrically driven, 6 rotating barrels, spitting out up to 6,000 rounds per minute. It didn't fire bullets, it unleashed storms. When a minigun opened up, the sound wasn't gunfire. It was a buzzsaw, a scream that drowned out everything else. Entire tree lanes disappeared under its fury. If the M60 was a thunderclap, the minigun was a hurricane. But such firepower came with a price. A minigun could chew through ammunition faster than you could believe. 2, 3, even 4,000 rounds could vanish in minutes. That meant you had to ration, to time your bursts, to know when to unleash hell and when to hold back. Because when the belts ran dry, you weren't just out of bullets, you were out of luck. Backup weapons were always within reach. An M14, an M16, something smaller you could grab if the M60 jammed or if the worst happened and you went down. Most of us prayed we'd never need them because if it came to using your rifle, it meant the bird was gone and you were alone on the ground. Every trigger pull was a calculation. Not just about hitting the enemy but about how much ammo you had left, how long the mission would last, and whether your brothers depended on that last belt. Ammo was life, and you learned the hard way that wasting it could kill not just you, but everyone strapped inside the Huey. That was the art of survival. Managing firepower, measuring bursts, and praying you made the right choice. If the weapons were our lifeline, the armor we carried was supposed to be our shield. But for door gunners, that shield was little more than a cruel joke. We were issued flak jackets, the same kind used by bomber crews in World War II. They were heavy, thick, and unbearably hot under the Vietnamese sun. Supposedly, they could stop shrapnel from an exploding shell. But against a rifle round, an AK-47 burst, or a 23mm anti-aircraft cannon, they were useless. The fabric soaked up sweat, weighed us down, and gave the illusion of safety without the reality of it. Then came the infamous chicken plates. Ceramic chest protectors, square and awkward, strapped across the torso. The idea was simple: cover the vital organs. The reality? They were so heavy and clumsy that many gunners refused to wear them. They restricted movement, dug into your shoulders, and in the chaos of battle they slowed you down. Some wore them half-heartedly, some kept them under their seats as makeshift armor for the groin, and many just left them behind altogether. That earned them the mocking nickname, chicken plates. The implication was clear: only a coward wore them. But the truth was darker. Even with the plates, you were still exposed from the sides, the arms, the head. They saved a few lives maybe. They ruined a lot of backs. The helmet was another piece of gear that looked better on paper than in practice. Designed primarily for communication with the intercom built in, it offered little real protection. A bullet didn't care about fiberglass. If anything, the helmet reminded you of how fragile you really were. The radio chatter buzzing in your ears could be cut off in an instant by the crack of incoming fire. So we adapted. Some strapped extra flak panels to the floor beneath them, hoping it would stop a round from below. Others rigged makeshift armor from scrap metal or even old ammo cans. Nothing ever felt like enough. Because the truth was brutal. On a Huey, there was no such thing as real protection. The helicopter itself wasn't armored, the doors were wide open, and you were hanging half your body into the wind. You weren't behind cover. You were the cover. We learned to live with it. You put on the jacket, maybe the plate, strapped on the helmet, and climbed into the bird. You joked about it, cursed it, ignored it, but deep down, you knew none of it would save you if your number was called. The only armor that mattered was luck, skill, and the man next to you keeping his finger tight on the trigger. Sometimes at night, when the base was quiet and the jungle hummed beyond the wire, I would stare at that flak jacket hanging by my cot. I'd think about how many times it had ridden into battle with me, how many bullets had passed through the air around us. And I knew the truth, it wasn't the jacket keeping me alive. It was chance. And chance has no weight, no straps, no ceramic plate. Just the cruel roll of dice in a war where tomorrow was never promised. Shooting from a moving helicopter was nothing like the training manuals suggested. On paper you aimed, squeezed and adjusted. In the air it was chaos. The Huey shook constantly, vibrations running through the frame and into your bones. The rotors beat the sky like a drum, throwing wind in every direction. Sometimes you were firing sideways into a gust strong enough to tear the breath from your lungs. Other times you were leaning halfway out the door, fighting not just the recoil of the M60 but gravity itself. Accuracy was a cruel illusion. No gunner in Vietnam truly aimed at a single man. You fired in arcs, sweeping the tree-line, stitching bursts across the jungle. You learned to lead your target, not aim directly at him but just ahead, compensating for the forward momentum of the helicopter. A bullet leaving the barrel carried the speed of the bird itself, curving into the unknown. We developed techniques out of necessity. Short bursts, 5 to 7 rounds, then pause, then adjust. Fire too long and the barrel overheated, the tracers went wild, the belt jammed. Fire too little and the enemy kept firing back. You balanced on a razor's edge, trying to keep control in a world that refused to stay still. And then there was the noise. The roar of the engine, the thunder of rotors, the hammering of your own weapon. It was deafening. Communication was a constant battle. Even with the intercom, words were swallowed by static, orders lost in the chaos. Sometimes all you had was instinct and trust in the pilot beside you. The danger wasn't just the enemy. It was physics. Every movement risked disaster. The straps that kept you tethered could snap. The monkey harness could fail. One slip, one moment of distraction and you'd be falling through open air. More than one gunner found himself dangling beneath the Huey, spinning helplessly while his crew scrambled to pull him back inside. And some weren't so lucky. The helicopter was both a weapon and a coffin. Every time you leaned out the door, half your body exposed to the sky, you knew you were daring fate. And fate had a way of reminding us how fragile we really were. We weren't aiming to be perfect marksmen. We were aiming to stay alive long enough to keep everyone else alive too. The enemy wasn't blind. They knew exactly what the door gunners were, the thin line of firepower keeping the helicopters alive. And that made us their favorite targets. The crack of an AK-47 was a sound we all learned to recognize instantly. Sharp, fast and deadly. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army carried them like extensions of their own bodies. They could hide in the jungle, crouched in shadows, and when the bird came low, those rifles lit up. It only took one lucky shot to bring a man down. We were half exposed, hanging out of a door, our torsos wide open to the green below. Sometimes you could feel the snap of rounds cutting the air inches from your skin. Sometimes you could smell the gunpowder drifting upward. But AKs were only the beginning. The real terror came from the anti-aircraft guns, the dreaded 23mm cannons. When those opened up, the whole sky came apart. Tracer rounds streaked past like red-hot spears, tearing holes through the air. If one of them hit, it wasn't a wound, it was obliteration. I watched Hueys vanish in fireballs when a cannon round found its mark. There was no fighting back against that, no heroic return fire. You just prayed they didn't see you or that their aim was off by a fraction. And then there were the RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. Crude, cheap, but terrifyingly effective. A single soldier with an RPG on his shoulder could bring down a helicopter worth millions. You could see the smoke trail snake up from the jungle floor, twisting toward you like a serpent. By the time you saw it, it was already too late. The pilots would yank the bird into violent maneuvers, and we would pour fire into the tree-line, trying to cut down whoever had launched it. But the fear always lingered. Somewhere out there, hidden in the green, another man was waiting with another rocket. We were hunters, yes, but we were also hunted. Every mission was a duel, and we weren't the ones choosing the battlefield. They were. The enemy blended with the jungle, with the villagers, with the very earth. We had the sky, but the sky made us visible. And visibility was vulnerability. There's a particular kind of terror that comes from knowing dozens of rifles are aimed up at you while you're strapped into a flying coffin. You keep firing, you keep moving, but in the back of your mind you're always waiting for that one shot. The one that finds you. We lived with the knowledge that the jungle had eyes, and those eyes were always looking back at us. War has a way of bending the rules of logic. In the madness of Vietnam, men often acted on impulse, on instinct, on raw emotion. And sometimes those split-second decisions led to stories so unbelievable that even years later, veterans shake their heads in disbelief. I remember a young gunner, barely out of high school, who jumped from his Huey during a landing. His crew had just cleared an enemy position with a brutal barrage of fire. As the helicopter touched down, he spotted one of the enemy soldiers still alive, crawling and bleeding in the dirt. Without a word, without even alerting his pilot, the boy leapt from the door. His instinct wasn't vengeance, it was compassion. He wanted to help the man he had just fought. The Huey lifted off seconds later, unaware he was gone. The gunner stood alone in enemy territory, unarmed except for the wounded man at his feet. For 30 long minutes he waited, heart pounding, staring at the tree-line, expecting death to come rushing out at any second. Somehow his crew realized their mistake and circled back. They found him standing there like a ghost, alive only by sheer miracle. Sometimes, compassion made men forget they were standing in the middle of hell. Then there was the story of the gunner who actually fell from his bird. It happened fast. During a sharp maneuver, his harness snapped. 1 second he was firing, the next he was gone. Everyone assumed he was dead. But fate has a twisted sense of humor. He landed not in the jungle, but directly on top of 2 Viet Cong soldiers. The fall knocked the wind out of them. In the confusion, the gunner managed to wrestle a rifle from one of the stunned men and kill them both. When his crew came back for him, he was standing there with a captured weapon in his hands. They said he looked like death himself, grinning through the smoke. For that act of survival he received a medal. But the truth was he had simply refused to die. And there were countless others. Moments when men fought through wounds that should have ended them. I knew a gunner who took a bullet through the shoulder. Blood soaked his flak jacket, his arm hung limp, but he kept his other hand locked on the M60. He refused to let go, refused to stop firing until the bird was safely clear. Later, when the medic finally pulled him off the gun, he collapsed unconscious. He lived, but he never regained full use of that arm. Yet he swore it was worth it because his brothers had survived. These weren't men chasing glory. They were men trapped in impossible moments, doing whatever it took to see one more sunrise. Survival wasn't about being fearless. It was about being unwilling to let fear win. If there was one mission that separated the brave from the broken, it was the medevac run. Dust off, they called it. A call would come through the radio, wounded men on the ground, pinned under fire, bleeding out. And we knew what that meant. It meant flying straight into hell. The jungle floor would be alive with gunfire. Bullets ripping through the trees, tracers arcing through the air, sometimes mortars pounding the landing zone. Yet the helicopter still had to come in low, hovering just long enough to pull the wounded aboard. For the door gunners, those moments were eternity. You fired until your barrel smoked, sweeping the tree-line, trying to carve a wall of lead between your brothers and the enemy. I remember one mission in particular. We were called to pull out an infantry squad that had walked straight into an ambush. The ground was chaos. Men screaming, rifles cracking, explosions shaking the earth. As we flared into the landing zone, I saw soldiers dragging their wounded, some crawling, some carrying men on their shoulders. We opened up with everything we had, the M60s spitting fire into the shadows. A round slammed into the side of the Huey, another tore through the floor, and still the pilot held steady. The wounded were hauled aboard, one after another, blood soaking the metal. And then as we lifted off, one of the gunners, hit in the leg, kept firing with the other, propped against the door frame, refusing to stop until we were clear. His boot filled with blood, but his finger never left the trigger. In those moments it wasn't about medals or orders. It was about saving lives, even if it meant losing your own. Stories like that were endless. A gunner who shielded a wounded soldier with his own body, taking bullets meant for someone else. Another who refused evacuation, insisting the medics take his place with a man more badly hurt. Some of them came home. Many did not. But the medevac missions carried a strange kind of purity. There was no confusion about why you were there. You weren't hunting, you weren't patrolling, you were saving. For a brief, terrible instant, you were pulling men out of the jaws of death. And that gave it a meaning that even war could not strip away. At night, after such missions, the silence in camp was heavier than usual. We would sit by the dim glow of cigarettes, staring into the dark, knowing we had pulled some back from the edge, but also knowing how many had been left behind. There were always more cries on the radio, always another dust-off waiting tomorrow. War gave us endless reasons to hate, but it was in saving each other that we remembered how to be human. After the missions ended, after the birds cooled down and the rotor blades stopped spinning, that was when the silence came. And sometimes the silence was worse than the noise. Because in silence, you were left alone with your thoughts, with the faces of the men who hadn't made it back. Every flight carried its own brand of tension. We learned to joke and smoke and laugh before takeoff, but once you strapped into that harness, the weight pressed down. You never knew if this flight would be the one that ended it all. You watched the ground drop away, your stomach twisting, and you told yourself to breathe. But the fear was always there, tucked into the back of your helmet, whispering. I remember the sound of bullets snapping past. I remember the smell of burnt gunpowder mixing with sweat. I remember looking over and seeing a man who had been alive seconds ago slump forward in his seat, his helmet cracked open, the life gone in an instant. And the worst part wasn't just losing him, it was knowing it could have been you. The casualties among door gunners were some of the highest in the war. We were half exposed, hanging from the side of a fragile machine, flying into enemy fire again and again. Some studies later claimed our odds of survival were lower than almost any other role in Vietnam. We didn't need studies to tell us that, we felt it every time we took off. It leaves a mark on a man, carrying that kind of tension day after day. Some of us buried it with humor. Some drowned it in bottles. Some tried to forget by never speaking of it again. But deep down, none of us ever left that jungle. You can pull a man out of the war, but you can't always pull the war out of the man. The war did not end when we flew home. For many of us, it never ended at all. It followed us into our beds, into our marriages, into the quiet hours of the night. The sounds of rotors and gunfire still echoed, even when the world around us was silent. I would wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I was still strapped to the side of that Huey, scanning the treeline for muzzle flashes. Some nights, I swore I could feel the wind on my face, hear the crack of rifles, smell the jungle. My wife would shake me awake, but it took minutes for me to return, to remember I wasn't there anymore. Many of us carried those ghosts. We drank too much. We shouted at shadows. We sat alone at kitchen tables, staring into the dark. We tried to build new lives, but part of us was stuck in 1968, in a sky filled with tracers. The hardest part was the faces. I can still see them, friends laughing before a mission, men sitting beside me with cigarettes dangling from their lips. And I can still see the way their eyes looked when life slipped out of them, when the harness went slack, when the gun fell silent. Those images don't fade. They sharpen with age. There is a special kind of grief in losing someone beside you, inches away, knowing that it could have been you. Survivors carry not just memory but guilt. Why him and not me? Why did I walk away when better men fell? Those questions burrow deep and never leave. Some men never spoke of it again. Others told their stories only after decades, when age softened the edges of the pain. But no matter how we tried to explain it, there were always moments we couldn't put into words. How do you tell someone what it feels like to watch a friend die, then keep firing because there's no time to mourn? How do you explain carrying that memory like a stone in your chest for 50 years? The truth is, war leaves its mark in silence as much as in gunfire. And door gunners, more than most, carried the weight of that silence. The image of the door gunner has lived far beyond the jungles of Vietnam. In America, it became a symbol, sometimes romanticized, sometimes misunderstood, but always remembered. Hollywood films showed young men gripping the M60, the wind tearing at their faces, eyes narrowed against the chaos. Rock songs of the era carried the thump of rotor blades, weaving war into music. And in newsreels, in grainy black and white footage, you could see them, silhouettes framed against the open sky, defiant and fragile at the same time. Yet behind those images was a different truth. The movies showed adrenaline, but they rarely showed the fear. The songs carried power, but they never carried the silence that followed. Real door gunners weren't legends. They were kids pulled from small towns, shoved into a war they barely understood. After the war, many struggled to find their place again. The battlefield had demanded constant alertness, but civilian life demanded stillness. And stillness was the hardest thing of all. Some found peace by writing memoirs, by putting their pain into words. Others picked up cameras, turning their memories into documentaries. A few spoke in classrooms, hoping to teach younger generations not just the history but the cost. American culture slowly began to reflect that duality, the myth and the reality. In movies like Platoon or We Were Soldiers, the image of the helicopter and its crew became central, a visual shorthand for the Vietnam War itself. Paintings, posters, and even album covers used the door gunner as a kind of raw, gritty symbol of survival. For some veterans, seeing those images on screen or in art was validating. For others, it was a painful reminder that no film could ever capture the weight of what it really felt like. Memorials began to rise. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., among the 58,000 names etched in stone, are countless gunners who never made it back. Their families leave photographs of young men in flight gear, smiling, unaware of what awaited them. Museums now display the M60s, the flak jackets, even the frayed harnesses, trying to tell the story of a job that was both ordinary and extraordinary. In gatherings of veterans, door gunners are often spoken of with a particular reverence. Pilots and infantry alike remember them as the lifeline in and out of the battlefield. They were not only gunners, they were shields, lookouts, and sometimes the last voices a wounded soldier heard before darkness closed in. Their legacy has also been carried forward in veteran organizations. Support groups for helicopter crews continue to meet, sharing stories, swapping photographs, raising funds for memorial scholarships. In these circles, the door gunner is remembered not as an action hero, but as a brother, flawed, afraid, but faithful until the end. Today, when we look back, the door gunner stands as both a symbol of courage and a warning. A symbol because their role embodies the willingness to risk everything for others. A warning because their stories remind us of the cost of war, not just in lives lost, but in the weight carried by those who returned. They were not the heroes of the movies. They were young men trembling, yet still pulling the trigger to protect their friends. And so, the story of the door gunner comes full circle. From the trembling hands gripping an M60 as the helicopter lifted off, to the silence that followed decades later, their journey was one of fear, courage, loss, and resilience. They were ordinary boys thrown into extraordinary circumstances, and yet, in the doorway of a Huey, they carried a burden larger than life. We have walked through their days, the waiting, the sudden chaos, the deafening gunfire. We have seen their weapons, their fragile gear, and the dangers that lurked in every shadow of the jungle. We have remembered the accidents, the miracles, the impossible choices. And finally, we have listened to the echoes that never faded, the scars that outlived the war itself. What we are left with is not just history but humanity. To remember the door gunners is to remember the cost of war, not measured only in battles won or lost but in young lives forever changed. They remind us that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the act of standing guard even while your body shakes. So I ask you, if it had been you, would you have had the courage to sit in that doorway, wind in your face, life on the line, knowing your job was to shield the men beside you? The truth is, very few of us will ever know that kind of test. But we can honor it. We can carry their stories forward. We can look at their photographs, read their memoirs, and say, you mattered. What you did mattered. If this story moved you, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, share your own memories or those of your family, and join us as we continue exploring the untold stories of the Vietnam War. Together we can make sure these voices are never forgotten. Because the door gunners were not just soldiers. They were young men clinging to life, clinging to each other. And for that, they deserve to be remembered.